All right, welcome to everyone who's joining. We're going to give it just a minute while everyone logs on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, good evening, everyone. It's 6 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started with tonight's webinar. My name is Maeve Snyder. I am the Education Chair for the Grand Strand Chapter of the South Carolina Native Plant Society. We're really excited you're all able to join us for our winter seminar. Just a few quick reminders before we get started. Let's see. I'll go over some helpful tips for Zoom, but for now, please know your webcam and your microphone are muted. If you close out other programs on your computer, that can help with bandwidth. If you're having any technical issues, you can ask for help in the Q&A box, or you can try leaving and rejoining the webinar through the link that you used to join. So our seminar tonight is the Grand Strand, Heart of the Carolina Coastal Plain. We're so excited to have our featured speaker, Dr. Patrick McMillan, who I'll introduce in a moment. But first, I just want to introduce the webinar hosts. I already mentioned I'm with the Grand Strand Chapter of the South Carolina Native Plant Society, and our co-host is Dominique with the Coastal Carolina University Arboretum. Dominique, do you want to give a quick intro?
Sure, yeah, that would be great. I think there's a slide in there. You click over to the next one.
I'll get you there in a minute.
Sure.
So I just wanted to give a few quick reminders about Zoom webinar. Again, you can use the Q&A box if you have questions. You can ask a question anytime during the webinar. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end, so we'll just save those questions until the end. All right, so Dominique, if you want to introduce the Arboretum.
Sure, thanks. So I am the Director of Arboriculture at Coastal Carolina University. What is a really exciting new effort at the university is that our entire main campus, which is 322 acres, has become an accredited arboretum. This is an evolution of a project that started with a group of my students back in 2019 to protect a small 1.5 acre stand of native trees on campus to make sure that that corner would not get developed. And so it's really neat to see it blossom into a campus-wide commitment. I would invite you, if you're curious to learn more, to visit our website. It is just coastal.edu/arboretum. On that website, you can see all kinds of information about our species collection, see species profiles. There is an interactive map where you can see our collection with color-coded dots and click on each dot to learn all about that particular tree. And we offer all kinds of guided tours and educational activities. So for anyone who's local and interested in visiting us or learning more, I would invite you to contact us at arboretum@coastal.edu.
Great, thank you, Dominique. And just to quickly introduce our local chapter of the Native Plant Society, the Grand Strand Chapter is the newest chapter of the state organization. We actually started last January, and since then we've gained over 100 members and done quite a few programs. So we're really excited with how this regional chapter has been growing, and we're really glad that everyone is able to join us tonight for a lecture focused on the unique ecology of our region. So I'll go ahead and introduce our featured speaker tonight, Dr. Patrick McMillan, who you may be familiar with from any number of botanical pursuits. He's a well-known figure in horticultural, taxonomic, and conservation circles. For over 30 years, he has worked as a professional botanist, horticulturalist, naturalist, biologist, and educator. He has published field guides and books, and also been featured on ETV. So Patrick, I'm sure you can give an even better introduction for yourself, but I'll turn it over to you. And thank you again for being here tonight.
Thank you very much. I was super excited when Maeve called and said that she wanted me to do a presentation for the new chapter, because all I've heard about from everyone in the native plant community circle is how great the Grand Strand Chapter is and how fast it's growing. So introduction to me, all you need to know is that I'm a plant nerd, and a nerd for South Carolina ecology and South Carolina plants. I've been working in South Carolina for well over 30 years and have seen a lot of change in South Carolina. Certain areas of the state, particularly the edges, the Beaufort County, Jasper County area in the southeast, the Horry Georgetown County in the northeast, and the Berkeley Charleston County have both attracted my attention and also changed more rapidly than any other portion of the state. A lot of that has to do with growth. And back in the early days of my career, well, sort of dating myself, but I did a talk for the Hammock Coast Birding Festival on Friday night down in Pawleys Island. And I managed to find an old slide that I used to show from when wood storks first started visiting the Carolinas and breeding here. And that happened in South Carolina in 1981. And it happened really as population in Florida and wetland degradation, and particularly South Florida, south of Lake Okeechobee, became such that the birds started to seek alternative habitats elsewhere. And by 2006, when I did the talk, we were definitely the second largest breeding population of wood storks in the country. And now we're kind of tied for first. And that's no surprise as the population continues to grow in South Florida. And what the wood storks are facing here now is population growth here. And back in 2006, I said, well, the population of South Carolina is expected to grow by 1 million people by 2030. And I was off by almost 10 years in my projection. It was the projection from the Strom Thurmond Institute at Clemson that made that prediction. But we're growing very rapidly. And one of the things that, not being a native South Carolinian myself, being a transplant, my family being a transplant from up north to far South Florida and then half back, right? To the Carolinas, where I did grow up in North Carolina, but my heart always went down there to the low country and the lower Pee Dee, which I think is some of the greatest parts of the country, bar none. So we are going to talk about the heart of the coastal plain, the Grand Strand, and I'm really being rather liberal here since you're the Grand Strand chapter. We are going to, make our way outside of the city limits of Myrtle Beach and into the surrounding area. The area that we're going to talk about is really not just a label on a map, because you can find maps and they define an area of South Carolina that is traditionally called the Pee Dee. And traditionally that would be Horry, Georgetown, Marion, Florence, Dillon, and some people, including Marlboro, Darlington, Chesterfield, Lee, Sumter, Clarendon, Williamsburg, Georgetown. The difference between the Low Country and the Pee Dee is an old designation back from when South Carolina was predominantly an agricultural state. The Low Country grew rice and Sea Island cotton. And north of that, we grew other crops, things like tobacco. And the Pee Dee was sort of the heart of the tobacco country in those days. So that's really where that term comes from, if you happen to encounter it, especially if you're new to South Carolina. If you happen to live in southern Georgetown County, they'll tell you live in the Low Country. Northern Georgetown County is actually probably better described as being part of the Pee Dee. Well, luckily for us, the Pee Dee, as we're going to see, is not just a designation based upon what grew there, but what grew there depended upon the soil conditions, which are actually based upon a geologic feature called the Cape Fear Arch that we're going to talk about a good deal tonight, that has ramifications for what natural communities occur in the Pee Dee. And so our area, the state, this greater Grand Strand area, holds a lot of things that you have to go to that part of the state to see. And they include some of the most beautiful wildflowers in South Carolina and in my mind, in the world. So as we run through this program, I will have everything identified with the common name, the scientific name, and I'll also include a range map from our book, The Guide to the Wildflowers of South Carolina, which Richard Porcher, Doug Rayner, and myself wrote, and David White, my photographer and videographer and editor for the TV show Expeditions with Patrick McMillan, helped us to organize and work with the photographs and produced all these maps, which is awesome. So these maps that are included in the book are the first update of range maps for South Carolina since the 1960s. And a lot has changed since that old book, that old Bible that we all used to run around with, the Radford, Ailes, and Bell, the manual of the vascular flora of the Carolinas. So when you see these dots on the map, it means that, yep, we have Zephyranthes simpsonii in Horry, Georgetown, and Williamsburg County documented, and also down here in Hampton County, one little population. But all but one of the populations of this plant is in the Pee Dee. We are learning things every single day about this area of the state and about the distribution and the ecology of wildflowers altogether in South Carolina. And that's illustrated by just how ignorant we are about this plant. When we wrote the book, which happened during the sort of the peak of the COVID in 2020, we had just a few months to completely rewrite the book. So I spent like 18 hours a day writing for about 7 months. And at the time, we thought that Zephyranthes simpsonii was found in areas that were maritime grasslands. Now, maritime meaning ocean or sea. Grasslands that are close to the coast, because that's where most of the populations that we had encountered were, and that's where we mostly see it in North Carolina. It turns out that that's not its preferred habitat. That's a place where it does live, and where the photograph that you see and that appears in the book was taken. But it wasn't until 2022 when I was doing some work in Jasper County and driving through Georgetown and Horry on my way back up to Raleigh, where I live now, doing that every week or so, that I started to notice where these plants were actually found. Now, Zephyranthes simpsonii is considered critically imperiled in South Carolina. Okay, critically imperiled means that we had less than 10 populations in the state for this plant. And indeed, we did. We only had a handful, like you can count on one hand, as of 2022. But now we've more than tripled the number of populations known, and we doubled them in a single day when I was driving through Georgetown and Horry County in May. So Simpsonii is related. The Florida Adamasco lily is a more southern form than the common Adamasco lily. The common Adamasco lily is a species of floodplains and rich bottomland forests. It has these large tepals, which are what we call petals and sepals when they're the same color, mostly in monocots they do that. These large tepals tend to arch outwards, and these can be pretty robust plants. Zephyranthes simpsonii is a little different. It holds its flowers cupped, and they have this beautiful rose tinge that when you see them in mass like this, really create a spectacle on the roadside. So you see this, if you're driving through northern or central Florida, you'll see large roadsides covered with these. But in South Carolina, I had never seen this until this very spot, which I came across, like I said, in May, back in 2022. And I came across 5 more locations just like it on a single highway headed from Georgetown through Horry County back up home towards Raleigh. And what I realized was that these plants were growing in the ecotone. Okay, now that's a fancy word that means in between, but they were growing in what was an ecotone, a transition between swamp forest and burned wetland, longleaf pine, pond cypress savannas. Okay. The interesting part about where I saw them is the longleaf pine, pond cypress savannas had been clear cut long ago. They had been, many of them bulldozed, and they have been fire suppressed for a long period of time. So that today they're really just thickets of hardwoods, but we see the remnants of those savannas in the ditches as we drive along this highway. And then bordering that, every time we went from cypress swamps, which still had the trees, into what used to be savannas, we'd find these. And the other thing that I noticed very importantly about the distribution of these things is 5 of the populations that I found that day grew directly across from Dollar General stores. So maybe if we want more of them, we just make more Dollar Generals. I don't know. But it's true that along this highway and along many of the highways now that we found these plants growing on, they're growing in a habitat that is severely altered, doesn't even occur in a natural setting, we think, anywhere in South Carolina today. And today these plants are just relegated to growing along roadside remnants of what used to be the fire maintained, which means burned frequently, ecotones, transitions between these two communities. And unfortunately for us, all 6 of the newly documented locations along this highway are within road widening areas. So at least portion of these populations will be lost yet again as the roads encroach and shrink their dwindling habitat. So there's lots of things that today exist more as ditch weeds than not. This one isn't completely dependent on the Grand Strand region, but certainly we see it growing in the Grand Strand region, and I've seen it several times in Horry County myself, and almost always in a ditch through a cypress swamp in almost the same landscape position that the Zephyranthes, the beautiful Florida Adamasco lily, would want to grow in. This is called Carolina birds in a nest, McBridea caroliniana. Everything is Carolinian about this plant. The range is centered on the Carolinas. It's a southeastern coastal plain endemic. It is a beautiful, large flowered mint without a minty smell. But it does something that for native plant gardeners, we appreciate, which is that it blooms at a time of year when not a lot is in flower. So this is a plant that flowers for us mostly in August. And what you're looking at here, in contrast to the other two pictures, is a garden plant. And it turns out that McBridea caroliniana, though it is incredibly rare in the wild, and most of those dots on the map that you saw no longer exist, in the garden, it not only grows, it thrives and spreads in just standard garden soil conditions. This was a single plant, a single 4-inch pot that I put into a kind of a swale in a rain garden that I built at Juniper Level Botanic Garden. And this one plant was this big by the end of its 2nd year. So an incredible plant to introduce into your garden, and it doesn't need the special conditions that it grows in the wild to do well in the garden. And we'll see that kind of over and over again as I come across these unique plants to this area that are great garden plants. I'm going to point them out. This one, full sun, soil that never dries out, but does not have to be as moist as this. In fact, it grows better in standard garden soil moisture than it does in a place that more closely approximates what it grows in the wild. So an incredible plant. Another incredible plant. This is one I had to sneak in here. It's not a Grand Strand plant, but you need to go look for it because I bet it's in Georgetown County. I bet it's in Williamsburg County, and it could be in Horry County. This is Ravenel's Oringo, and it's a plant that my dear friend Richard Pichet and I searched for about 20 years in South Carolina, because the last time it was seen in South Carolina before our rediscovery of this plant in the Francis Marion National Forest was in the 1840s, when it was collected by Henry William Ravenel, and that was the type location. It disappeared for 150 plus years, almost 160 years before we finally relocated. And again, where did we find it? We didn't find it in some beautiful, well-burned habitat, a gorgeous place. I found it in a ditch behind the Bull Bay Trading Company in McClellanville. Again, plants that used to have a habitat that today are relegated to marginal habitats. And that's largely a consequence of the changes we've made in the habitat because of lack of fire and just bunches of people, which oftentimes does lead to a lack of fire. So it's a plant I wanted to sneak in here because, again, flowers in August and September with these beautiful downy blue clusters. You would never, if you weren't a plant expert, you would never believe that this is actually a fancy carrot, but this is. It's in the carrot family, and it has tightly held umbels, because everything in the carrot family has umbels of flowers. If you think about Queen Anne's lace, that's a great example of a flower of something in the carrot family. In this one, it just doesn't have long pedicels to the flower. They're all kind of just still umbellate, but in this globular head. The flowers fade from blue to white to pink. So this is really a spectacular thing for the garden. And again, even though it grows in sort of wetland savanna type soils, usually with a hint of calcium to them in the wild, that are wet, it doesn't like to grow that way in cultivation. It prefers to grow in standard garden soil, standard garden moisture, and full sun. And this is second only to mountain mints for drawing in pollinators. I've never seen a plant that draws in more wasps. You may not want wasps in your garden, but they're critical native pollinators. And this is a great plant to feed them. And it looks fantastic at a time of year when our gardens really feel tired. Okay, so grass of Parnassus is another one of our plants that you have to go to the Grand Strand area, to the Pee Dee, to see in South Carolina. It does not grow down in the rice growing areas. It grows north of the rice growing areas in sort of central Georgetown County and Horry County and up into North Carolina. Incredible plant because of these really late flowers. They oftentimes aren't even in flower until close to the first week in November. But in October, November, even into December, flowering species in its own family, Parnassiaceae. And these delicate white flowers are held up above this sort of clean looking foliage, when it's not at the end of the year, at least it's clean looking. And the flowers are striped with green. It's very elegant, very beautiful, and very, very rare. So this plant has in South Carolina distribution centered, again, on the Pee Dee, not in the low country, in the Pee Dee. And then if we look at it globally, it's centered on that little part of North Carolina, that range. If you look at the yellow on the map here, you notice that this is sort of the center of its distribution. It extends north, it extends south, and extends inland. And then it's also in the panhandle of Florida and nowhere in between. This is a natural distribution pattern for many of the plants that are special in South Carolina for the Grand Strand area. And there's a reason behind it. Why? Why do you have this pattern? Well, we have that pattern because both areas, here in the panhandle, central panhandle of Florida, and also up here in southeastern North Carolina from Carteret County down to Georgetown County, we have areas that are considered arches. Okay, and this is a geologic term. An arch is a place where essentially you can think about the continent bowing out into the ocean, and then bites are the opposite. It's a place where the coastline bends inward. So for us in South Carolina, our coastline is composed of the Cape Fear Arch from around the Pee Dee River up to Carteret County in North Carolina and inland to encompass the area in South Carolina that we call the Pee Dee. And the Georgia Bight includes everything from just north of the Santee River in South Carolina all the way down through northern Florida. And these two areas are very different when we look at the soils. They're different when we look at the soils for the reason that we have an arch and a bight. We have one area that has deposition from up above through big brown water rivers like the Santee, silty soils coming down and coastline moving inward. Up in the arch, you have blackwater rivers, huge blackwater rivers like the Waccamaw, right? The Black River that push down and carry white sands, if sands at all, as deposition layers. And our soils, and in particular, one type of soil, really become abundant in these arch areas. So here you can see again, this is from my friend Richard LeBlanc's paper on the Cape Fear Arch endemics in 2001. And you can see these dark areas he has shaded on North Carolina and down in South Carolina. You look at where that's at, it's the Grand Strand area down to central Georgetown County. And then again, up around Dillon, Marlborough, and Marion County. And these dark areas are soils called spodosols, okay? What is a spodosol? Well, a spodosol is a soil that has generally white sands at the surface. So go out in your backyard if you live in Horry County, dig in the ground. You'll see white sand at the surface, right? If you haven't mixed it up from deep down below, you'll see white sand at the surface. And if you dig down 4, 6, 8, 10 inches, you come to an area where it's really wet. You dig down below that, and we have what's called a spodic horizon. We have a layer of peat, partially decomposed organic material that creates a barrier and perches water just above the peat, okay? And that provides a really unique condition where you have a dry surface to the soil that's very sandy, and then a moist layer just below the surface from the perched water table by what we call a spodosol, okay? So if you didn't learn anything else tonight, you learn spodosols. That's one of the things that makes our area so unique in the Grand Strand and the Pee Dee. These spodosols are the type of soils that we try to replicate when we build carnivorous plant bogs. Because what do? You have a lined container and you have drainage holes 4 to 6 inches below the surface of the soil, right? You're trying to duplicate what happens naturally at places like Lewis Ocean Bay, which has huge areas of spodosols below, called entosols, alien sorted drier sites. And where those drier sites go down to the Pocosin, we have an area of spodosol with perched water tables that are perfect for the one plant that above all others illustrates how important the Cape Fear Arch is, because it's only found on the Cape Fear Arch, and that's Venus flytrap, right? Dionea muscipula, whose range looks just like the range of Parnassia caroliniana, with the exception that there's one aberrant collection from the 1950s down here in Charleston County that no one has found since the 50s. May have just been planted there. We don't know. But this plant is almost exclusively found on spodosol soils and areas of what we call ultisols, slightly siltier soils that border most of the time spodosols, where fire is very frequent and where water table is within a few inches of the surface of the soil, right? But it's not just the soil. The spodosols are really awesome themselves, but without one secret ingredient, you don't have Venus flytraps. The typical habitat of Venus flytraps, and this is actually a picture I took back in the day at Lewis Ocean Bay over here on the right-hand side of this picture. This is a typical longleaf pine wiregrass savanna on spodosol soils. I think this was a Leon series soil. It's very open, widely spaced trees, even though a lot of those aren't longleaf. Originally they were, but we're burning it as though it was. And the fire is the secret ingredient and the secret weapon for producing diversity in the Pee Dee. Back when I was at Clemson, I did a little, not truly scientific, but just listed all of the species that depend on fire in South Carolina. And it turned out that, at least in my opinion, we would lose 60% of the diversity of wildflowers in South Carolina if we did not have low intensity ground fires burning through our special communities in the state. And the most special type of habitat in the Pee Dee are these spodosol soil, flatwoods, and savannas that receive fire, exactly like Lewis Ocean Bay. And that's why Lewis Ocean Bay is such a top priority for people who care about preserving the diversity, keeping Venus flytraps in South Carolina. It's our last best chance, really, to do that in the state, and we just simply can't lose it. Having the property protected is awesome, but having it protected without burning it is just a slow death. And we've seen slow death in my lifetime. Back when I started working in South Carolina, I knew 4 locations for yellow fringeless orchid, a beautiful relative of the yellow fringed orchid that you're probably familiar with, but without the lacerations on the lip of each one of these tiny orchid flowers. And the yellow fringeless orchid was last seen in South Carolina, I think, by me at one site in Charleston County. And today we have this listed as potentially historical. That's really sad. That means that we potentially have lost yellow fringeless orchid in South Carolina. Certainly there was an amazing population in Georgetown County, which still could be there on private property. But the fact that we're not burning, and the fact that this orchid requires those wet, burned, grassy savannas that demand fire, have really sort of just put this out of reach for us these days in South Carolina. We see the same thing with this plant. It's not the world's most beautiful plant, but it is federally endangered. And South Carolina is the epicenter of its distribution, formerly known from Massachusetts to Florida and Alabama. And today, almost all of the sites for American chaff seed, Schwalbia americana, are to be found in South Carolina. This is a plant that requires frequent fire to grow, and it's a hemiparasite. It's partially parasitic on the roots of things like silky leaf golden aster, Pideopsis graminifolia, and it requires the frequent fire for all aspects of its life, and without it, it disappears. So today, a handful of locations compared to what it was 30 years ago, but still better off in South Carolina than any other state in the union, and really extirpated from almost all states in which it formerly occurred. And this is a Georgia, South Carolina, maybe Alabama now only plant. So when we burn, we also take away a lot of the competition that limits how many plants can occupy a particular piece of ground. And a lot of times we'll raise the overall productivity. So this is a beautifully burned piece of a savanna in Georgetown County, and was burned just 3 months before I took this photograph. It's kind of an old photograph, but I remember it well. And when you look at the diversity there, we can have 90, 100 species of plants in a very small patch of ground that would fit inside my dining room here, where I'm speaking to you from, because the fire is, all those plants depend on it, but they all are being removed from competition with each other for light, for nutrients, for space, by the action of the fire burning off, clearing out the dead vegetation and removing woody plants, which would then hog up the space and push out all the beautiful herbaceous plants. Okay, so Horry County, Georgetown County, the places that you guys live, these areas are the only part of the state with a lot of spodosols. Some of our carnivorous plants depend on spodosols. So guess what? You have all 4 of the pitcher plant species in Horry and Georgetown County. Can't say that in Berkeley County, just a little bit south. Even though the diversity is phenomenal there, they have the yellow pitcher plant, They have the hooded pitcher plant, which is today probably our most widespread remaining species. All of these just dramatically declined from what they were back in the 80s and 90s when I started working in South Carolina. Sweet pitcher plant along the edges of the Pocosin and slightly wetter situations. And then you guys also have southern purple pitcher plant. So folks that visit places like Maine or even up in Michigan, Minnesota, Canada, they're always amazed that there are pitcher plants there around those kettle hole ponds. Or if they're from up there and they move down here, they're amazed that they're in the South too. Well, these pitcher plants belong to the same species that occurs in Maine, but this is the southern variety of it. It has a very wavy, heavily veined opening to the pitcher, and it's called variety venosa. And you can see down here, this plant ranges from Virginia to Georgia, but the vast majority of it is in North and South Carolina. And in South Carolina, the majority of our populations are in the Pee Dee, and if you include Chesterfield County and Pee Dee, you have almost all of them. So with all four present, we also find hybrids, right? Like this beautiful hybrid between purple pitcher plant and yellow pitcher plant. We find those happening in the wild. So all this sand you guys have, longleaf pine, turkey oak, xeric scrub ridge. So instead of spodosols, these are entasols. So along the edges of our Carolina bays and along the southern edges of our large Blackwater rivers, we find large ridges of what we call aeolian sorted sands. These are sands that were sorted by the wind, ancient sands sorted by the wind, to leave these bright white surfaces. And many of you have probably walked through places that look like this in Horry and Georgetown County and not realize just how spectacular that is. This is essentially an extension of the Florida scrub ecosystem into the Carolinas. There are places that do have longleaf pine, they do have turkey oaks, but Horry County is the northernmost location in the entire world for this unusual shrub called, oops, let me skip to the shrub. Florida rosemary, Ceratiola iricoides. Looks like it's a kind of juniper. It's actually more closely related to rhododendron. This is in the Empetraceae, or if you combine those two in the same family as rhododendron. But a dioecious, strange male and female on different plant, endemic to those scrub ridges, those really high and really dry sand piles that we have in the Cape Fear Arch. So pretty special. Next time you see one, realize how special it is. And there's all kinds of research if you get into reading about it, about the allelopathic exudates, which means when it rains, the water that drips through this shrub apparently prevents the germination of other plants around its roots. So it kind of protects itself from competition using that. And there's all kinds of other things. Sand live oak, a live oak that's a little more shrubby with cupped leaves, even a huge fruited beak sedge that are all specialists in South Carolina in that area. One-sided blazing stars, and blazing stars are popular in the native plant trade, but you almost never see one-sided blazing star, which is a sandhill species that, guess what, pops up on Sandy Island down in Georgetown County in our area on these high, dry entisol ridges. But a close relative that also has one-sided flowers that are purple instead of white, Coker's blazing star, is commonly found in this kind of habitat. Okay, so just to look at some other things. Sandhills milkweed grows there. It's great. Of course, Horry County is kind of the epicenter also for Carolina bays. These strange elliptical depressions, we still don't know how or why, how they were formed exactly, oftentimes associated with limestone depressions, which are these unusually shaped ones. And unfortunately, this is not from Horry County. This is a Berkeley County site. This is Florida Bay out in the Francis Marion National Forest. But the bays themselves often have sand ridges on their margins that have these high entisolic ridges. Okay, I don't have time to go into Carolina bays, but they're awesome. They contain amazing habitat for all forms of life. But in our neck of the woods, most of our bays belong to one class, and that is the peat-based bays. So we've been talking about soils, sandy, Here we're talking about one that is a dome of peat, partially decomposed, waterlogged vegetation that is exactly what it sounds like. It's peat, right? Peat is highly acidic, often completely organic, and saturated in most cases. So to grow here, you have to be able to tolerate those conditions. And most things that do have evergreen bay-like leaves, which is why we call these Carolina bays. They're named after the swamp bay, which has wonderful aromatic leaves that you can even use in cooking as a substitute for red bay. Sweet bay, a magnolia with leaves that look just like red bay, and loblolly bay, related to camellias with that flower and leaves that look almost the same. They're often completely impenetrable thickets of shrubs that look almost identical. So if you're not a botanist, they may look pretty confusing, but they're actually not diverse communities. There are only a handful of these shrubs, but because they're impenetrable, your neck of the woods has one of the healthiest black bear populations in the Southeast. Why? Because they can seek refuge in those impenetrable thickets that are also full of good fruits like blueberries. The one plant that makes it more impenetrable than anything else is bamboo vine, Smilex laurifolia, also called blasphemy vine, because the huge, nasty greenbrier actually prickles that it has, and they'll rip you apart if you try to walk through it and cause you to commit blasphemy. Even though we don't often think of these burning, they are also fire-maintained communities. And this is a picture from a recently burned Pocosin in Charleston County, South Carolina. And even though it looks completely and utterly destroyed, these Pocosins require that fire to open up the habitat to allow other things to be a part of it. So this is part of the same Pocosin just 6 weeks after the fire that we saw. And even the pond pines that you see back here that occur in the bays, you can see them resprouting, epicorneal sprouting right along the trunk. As we move from those high ridges down to the bay, there's that special area of spodosols called the ecotone. And the ecotone has unique things that you have to go to your neck of the woods to see, like southern bog buttons, stalked milkweed, which is almost gone in South Carolina. That picture actually taken in Horry County at Lewis Ocean Bay. But a delicate, beautiful little milkweed that occupies just that narrow zone. And as you work your way into the bay itself, into the Pocosin, another unique feature for the Grand Strand, leatherleaf, Chamaedaphne colliculata, which is blooming right now and makes a wonderful shrub. If you have acidic soil in your yard, a wonderful low shrub for really early flowers. You don't have to plant Pieris japonica, an introduced thing. You can plant the native. As you get a little deeper, even Carolina wiki, and then you get into the really thick stuff. Well, when we do have a fire burn through and we create open areas, oftentimes they're filled with things, beautiful things, like our largest flowered Platanthera, large white fringed orchid, and one looking just like its relative peace lily, the spoon flower, Peltandra sagittifolia, uniquely common in the bays, particularly in your neck of the woods. And even Virginia chain fern, almost always associated with Pocosins, unlike its relative, the netted chain fern, which is associated with river floodplains and other nutrient-rich wetlands. This one likes it acidic. And even very, very northern things like tawny cotton sedge, something that we think of growing in mountain bogs, pops up also down in Horry County in some of the larger bays when we get these burnouts and big sphagnous openings. So your unique communities, the longleaf pine flatwoods, think about all the beautiful things. Sometimes really weird things happen, like out at the Myrtle Beach National Golf Course, there's a population of southern evergreen blueberry. You have to go all the way down to the southeastern corner of South Carolina, south through Florida, to see the rest of the world's population. But those spodosols have brought it up into Horry County. When you get slightly wetter soils, we call those savannas. And savannas Also can be spodosol or siltier soils if they're burned frequently enough. And these tend to hold most of the endemic species that we find in the Grand Strand. Endemic means found in one area and nowhere else. So Carolina loosestrife, a imperiled species globally and locally, and a critically imperiled one, Pocosin loosestrife, which occurs in North Carolina in the Cape Fear Arch, but not South Carolina. But at least we have loomises. A beauty that most people don't see because they don't go out into savannas in October through November when it blooms is Carolina bog asphodel, Tophelia glabra. Pretty easily told apart from its close relative, the more common southern bog asphodel, by the lack of these hairs along the stem and leaves, and also by the fact that southern bog asphodel blooms in June, this one blooms in October. This is a Cape Fear Arch endemic, and you have to go to the Grand Strand to see it if you want to see it in South Carolina. They're great plants in this habitat for your garden. A lot of people get bummed out about mountain mint because it spreads like wildfire. Well, good for you. Guess what? There is a native Grand Strand species called Pycnanthemum flexuosum. It never spreads. It's a clumping species, and it's just as attractive to the pollinators. And its native habitat is savannas, but it'll grow in standard garden conditions. Coreopsis. You need to get the Guide to the Wildflowers of South Carolina if you get confused about what you're seeing out there, because things like these DYCs, damn yellow composites, right? Damn yellow daisies, like Coreopsis can be very frustrating to tell apart, but we can solve that really quick. And we went to great lengths to talk about it in the similar species section of our book. So confusing, but great plants. All of them make wonderful garden plants in standard soil, except for pool Coreopsis, which you have to grow with your pitcher plants in slightly wetter soil. Pool Coreopsis flowers in May. It's very tall, has narrow basal leaves. Low leaves have lobes on them, like you see here. Coastal plain tickseed looks almost identical. Does not have the lobes, but it flowers in October. All right, so you'd never confuse it. This makes an incredible garden plant. It's one of the better Coreopsis, but in my opinion, not the best. Savannah Coreopsis also flowers in October, but and has been confused even by botanists that have written floras and lumped with gladiata. But instead of gladiata, this plant has much smaller, very thick, leathery leaves, and you can see the black dots. Those are resin dots in the leaves that very quickly allow you to tell the difference between the delicate Savannah Coreopsis and the big honking Coreopsis gladiata, the coastal plain tickseed. And then there is the one that makes the most spectacular garden plant, swamp Coreopsis, Coreopsis palustris. Spreads very slowly, but forms absolutely beautiful, dense, ground covering clumps that flower in October in your garden. This is at Juniper Level Botanic Garden. It's a clump that's been growing for about 6 years from 4 plants, believe it or not, from 4 plants in 6 years. Swamp Coreopsis also is one of the rarest Coreopsis in South Carolina. So good thing that it's in the trade, because this is known reliably from 2 sites in South Carolina, one in Horry County, one in Georgetown County. And its habitat is drawdown zones on the Waccamaw River. What is a drawdown zone? I've been using all these crazy terms, haven't I? Well, a drawdown zone is where tides or drought take the standard water level and pull it down to expose mud. And on black water rivers, and when we look at this image from the book Life at the Water's Edge, which is one of the first books that I was blessed to be able to participate in when I was at Clemson, we can see large brown water rivers and large black water rivers emptying into South Carolina. And these brown water rivers, like the Waccamaw Pee Dee drainage, the little Pee Dee, the Waccamaw, they have some of the most diverse and unique drawdown communities in the world. Matter of fact, these Blackwater rivers in our area have their own spatterdock, their own pond lily. So if you go to wetlands anywhere else in the southeast, you'll see the round-leaved relative of the water lily called the cow lily or the broadleaf pond lily, Nuphar advena. But if you're in the Waccamaw or the Black River, you see this with these long, beautiful sagittate leaves, a similar flower. This species is Nuphar sagittatifolia, and it's called the narrow-leaf pond lily or the Cape Fear spatterdock because it's found in the Cape Fear Arch region only. There are other specialties that you probably had no idea. If you're new to the area, you had no idea how special it was. There's a special Hymenocallis, a special spider lily, one of the most beautiful plants on earth called Hymenocallis pygmaea, found in the drawdown zones and the backwaters of the Waccamaw River, and the Waccamaw Black and Pee Dee. There's a beautiful yellow-flowered hedge hyssop, Gradiola lutea, found in the same places. And one of the most stunning plants, Plymouth gentian, Gentiana kennediana, which ranges in Massachusetts, New Jersey, and the North and South Carolina in the Cape Fear Arch. The largest flowered of our rose gentians, and one of the most garden worthy, and it grows wonderful in just standard moist garden soil. Incredible plant. Even a sundrop that's almost endemic to the Cape Fear Arch. It's found in the Cape Fear Arch and then also pops up in the Edisto, which is another one of these Blackwater rivers. And the riverbank sundrop turns out to be a wonderful garden plant because it doesn't spread all over like the pink sundrop. And it flowers for an incredibly long period of time. So for almost 3 months, these bushes from a semi-woody stem produce these sundrop flowers. We're growing this now at juniper level and probably Plant Delights will offer it very shortly because it grows very easily from seed. And in the wild, its only habitat is growing on the bases of trees like tupelo and cypress between the high and the low water mark in the drawdown of these Blackwater rivers. Another great wetland plant from the southeast that does absolutely fine in standard garden soil is Elliott's aster. Flowers in November and December, and unlike so many other asters, doesn't have long branches that cause it to flop over when you use it as a tall border like I did here in the garden. It's the most garden-worthy tall aster there is, and it draws the last of the season pollinators in numbers like nothing I've ever seen. Bees, wasps, flies, everything loves Elliott's aster. And guess what? It's growing in the ditches right outside your houses, right there in the Grand Strand. And we covet it now pretty heavily throughout the area. So you live in a great area with lots of uniqueness and the opportunity to make a big difference. An area that has plants that are found only in 2 locations in the entire world, like Carolina hedge nettle. People are drawn to the strand by the strand itself, and it's the people that are there that are both causing the problem with the loss of habitat, but also causing the problem with the loss of the ability to burn. And so remember, when you're going even to the beach, that there's even things on the beach like sea beach amaranth in your neck of the world that are almost gone everywhere else except the Hammock Coast and the Grand Strand of South Carolina. It's an incredibly important place. And I'm just so grateful that there's so much activity in the South Carolina Native Plant Society Grand Strand, because you guys need to be planting, growing, and fighting for the preservation of these plants. And that really, guys, means we need to fight for the right for these plants to have the natural process that maintains them in so many cases. And then in that case, that's fire. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patrick. That was an amazing talk. I love that you ended with sea beach amaranth. Our chapter has done some restoration activities with that plant, so that's really special. So we have some time for questions, maybe just 1 or 2 if people want to put them in the Q&A. I might kick us off with a question, Patrick, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So it seems like the Pee Dee has its own unique botanical identity. For a lot of our chapter members who are interested in native plants for home gardens, what
Yeah.
would a Pee Dee home garden look like with native plants?
What would a PD home garden look like? Well, a lot of the plants that I have been talking about, plants that you see growing around, right? In your area, definitely, try to incorporate as many things that you can that come from those fire maintained habitats, because we can provide a surrogate for that with our backyard gardens and keep the pollinators and everything that requires those unique plants around and keep those plants around, even in our backyard. Fill space. This is a plant, Phalaenota flora. This is a cultivar that I selected from Charleston County called Ramble On. It's just a wild selection. It doesn't mean it's not the real species, but this is a plant that flowers 12 months a year, covers the ground. You can grow other things through it. And rather than use mulch and other things, you're providing a living surface, which is the same surface that you see in ditches and along the edges of parking lots when you go to the beach. Same plant, but in a garden, it looks like this. It means bringing things like the sunflower that you see growing in the ditches. That swamp sunflower, the real one, is not a horrible tall spreading beast. It's a fairly slowly spreading 2.5 to 3 foot tall plant. The problem is we don't have it in the native plant trade. The plants we sell as swamp sunflower in the native plant trade are muck sunflower. So you have to be very careful. Don't just go buy swamp sunflower and think that's it. Buy it for somebody who knows. So I selected a form from Berkeley County. This is in my trial gardens. And I just took this picture in October. Fantastic. Make sure your yard is full of these things. As many things as you can stack in, as many places as you have, and make as many niches of native plants as you possibly can. But take the time to understand if they're part of your backyard. So go buy the book, right? And see what grows in Horry County. And then, what can I plant from there? If you want to plant all kinds of other things, great. But let's try to make sure we include the things that are uniquely Horry County.
Love it. We had another question. You had mentioned how some plants will grow in very specific conditions, but then they can also do well in ordinary garden soil. They asked to, define what is ordinary garden soil, especially like within Horry County where we have a lot of sandy soils. They asked, does it need to be amended with compost?
So yeah, so the swamp sunflower picture that's right up there right now, that is growing in pure sand amended with compost. Does it have to be amended with compost? No. But if you want to have a production like I'm showing you there, rather than something that looks more like, a few flowers here and there, then you'll need to have richer soils. So yeah, it's sands amended with compost. You don't have to get crazy and go get clay. All the photographs that I showed you of any garden plants today come from sands. They're from Fuquay series sands here in North Carolina, and basically no different growing conditions than what you'd have there. The only difference is that we do amend with compost. Absolutely.
Awesome.
But you don't have to. I mean, they'll grow in the regular sands. The point about regular garden soil, many of these things grow in savannas or wet ditches in the wild. And in cultivation, they don't have to do that. They actually do better away from their native habitat than they do in it. And that's because in their native habitat, they can compete because they can actually grow in those habitats and other things can't. When you remove the competition in the garden, they don't have to be limited to that habitat type.
Yeah, as I can attest to with my 8 foot tall seaside goldenrod.
Yes. Yeah.
All right, so I think I just want to answer one question that a lot of people might be thinking of. We are going to share a PDF of Patrick's slides as a follow-up to everyone watching. And then I had a few questions in the chat about where to acquire native plants. So I think what we'll do now for the sake of time is wrap up, and our chapter president, Victoria is going to give some updates about future chapter events, but I just want to say one more time, a huge thank you to Patrick for being here and sharing all this amazing information, and also thank you to everyone watching. All right, Victoria, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. And you'll pull up our slides?
Yes, give me one sec.
Okay. That was fantastic. And we have a couple of events from the Grand Strand chapter, but first we're going to talk about the CCU's Arboretum's upcoming event. So I'll actually turn it over to Dominique in just a second.
Maeve, on my screen, I'm still seeing Patrick's slide. I don't know.
How about now? Is that working?
There we go.
There we
Yes,
go.
now. Thank you. So I'll just echo Maeve and Victoria's thanks to you, Patrick. That was wonderful. And I'm so glad that we'll be receiving a copy of those slides because it's too much to possibly just remember by listening to you for these 45 minutes. For those of you who are interested in finding native plants, specifically native trees, we will be having our second annual native tree giveaway as part of the CCU Arboretum's Arbor Day celebration. So this year that's happening on Friday, April 26th. The giveaway will be from 10 a.m. to noon. We will be giving away 200 3-gallon potted native trees, a variety of species. For those of you who are familiar with our campus, it's beside a building called the Wheelwright Auditorium. As we get closer to the time, we'll be communicating about this event, but also if you have questions, please feel free to contact me, and you can do that at the email that you see here on your screen, arboretum@coastal.edu. I can say from last year that we had folks waiting before 10 a.m. to get in there and pick their favorite trees, and the trees went pretty quickly. So 10 a.m. to noon, but if you're interested in getting some native trees to take home and plant in your own gardens, I would just encourage you to plan on coming earlier in the day so that you don't arrive with slim pickings towards the end.
That's one awesome opportunity to get some native trees, and we'll talk about some more. So here's some upcoming events from our chapter. The first one I have to talk about is actually a call for artists. So over the past year, we've identified a lot of great partners and a lot of projects in our area, and a lot of people who want to promote native plants and install them and all sorts of efforts. So these efforts require money, and we would like to fund those opportunities. So what we're going to be doing is selling some sort of beautiful native plant sticker or t-shirt. And we need some art to go on those t-shirts and stickers. So grand prize, $25, but the big prize is bragging rights for forever. And you'll see your design all around the Grand Strand, hopefully. So if you'd like to enter, you can use the QR code, and we will send this information in an email after the, as a follow-up with a whole bunch of links. So next slide. Next, so the Grand Strand chapter is a partner on the project that's on the Waccamaw Week 2024, which is an annual education and outreach event focused on the Waccamaw River watershed. And this year it's all about native plants. So our theme is Grow with the Flow, and you'll get opportunity to see some of the amazing plants that Patrick talked about, either in person or through one of our events. So we'll hope you join us for that. You can check out winyanrivers.org for more information, or stay tuned to our Grand Strand Chapter newsletter, which we will be sure to include these events. That's that one. And then to stay on top of all that we're doing, you can join us at our next chapter meeting, which our next one will be Thursday, March 21st. We meet in Conway. You can meet in person at CCU, or you can also join us virtually via Zoom. And for that information, you got to sign up for our newsletter to get that Zoom link. Otherwise, we'll see you in person. And we typically meet at 6. I think that's right, 6. All right. Next one. So we've been doing a lot of great field trips over the past year, and it's party time for us to go back. So the Education Committee has lined up our March field trip to the Myrtle Beach State Park, where we will be doing an invasive species removal volunteer day. If you'd like to join, you can find that information at our next chapter meeting or in our newsletter. Next one. And this will be an opportunity, our 2024 spring plant sale, to get some of the amazing plants that Patrick talked about. Maybe not so many of those, the most wild ones, you might have to join us for a field trip to see those, but you might be able to get some of these for your own home garden. That will be May 4th, 2024. It'll be held in downtown Conway at the Town Green, and we'll have more information about that. And this was backed by popular demand. Our first plant sale was in October, and it was such a success. So we're looking forward to hosting another one. Yeah, and next slide. So we hope you'll consider joining the South Carolina Native Plant Society. Your membership dues help us conduct chapter events like some of the ones you've seen, and contribute to our statewide efforts, including protecting some of our amazing natural spaces. So you don't have to be a member to join any of our events. However, it does give you first access to sign up to field trips, and some of our field trips go pretty quick. And you also will get first access to our upcoming native plant sale. So that's all we have for you this evening. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this talk, also links to purchase Patrick's book, all the events we mentioned, and links to our newsletter, so many links. So with that being said, on behalf of the CCU Arboretum and the Grand Strand Chapter of the South Carolina Native Plant Society, thank you so much. Thank you to Patrick, and thank you all for spending an evening with a bunch of plant nerds. We hope you have a good night. Bye.